I think everybody wants to build like a highly available, resilient system that's secure. And so we have this like knack of looking to those that are ahead of us. So like the engineering teams that we want to try to like model ourselves after. So like the Netflixes, the Amazons, the Googles. And we read about the technologies that they're using and they're like, oh, like to be that, we need to be using those technologies as well. Becoming a founder now, it's like my opinion is almost the exact opposite. Like you need to go use the services and technologies that like get you to the next step, because you don't know what you don't know the answer to the next question yet. So like just get to the next question and use the thing that gets you there the fastest. So if that's like running a stateful EC2 instance, that's just running one Docker container, like have at it. Don't go solve problems until you actually have them.
What does Depot's infrastructure look like behind the scenes? Hey folks, this is Alex. Today we have on Kyle Galbraith, who he's the founder of Depot.dev, which is just a way to make your Docker builds, your GitHub action runners just run significantly faster, basically with no changes to your application, right? So super fascinating technical stuff there, but I also really loved our conversation just about being a founder, and especially about being a founder of a dev tools company. I think he had a lot of interesting stuff to talk about there around marketing. You know, they went through YC, around that experience, around profitability and what you're building and all that sort of stuff. I thought it was super interesting. I've known Kyle for a while, and it's been fun to just like watch his trajectory. And it looks like Depot's really taken off. So, you know, if you have any comments, suggestions, any of that stuff, feel free to reach out to me or Sean. If you want people to be on the show, let us know. With that, let's get to the show. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So you and I crossed paths a while ago now, and really like in the serverless space, we're both sort of doing stuff there, and that's how I got to know you. And then at some point, you sort of switched paths and move over like more to the container side, and built this really cool company around faster container image building and things like that. So maybe tell us about you, tell us about Depot, and what will we talk about today?
Yeah, so my name's Kyle Galbraith. I'm from Portland, Oregon originally. Moved to the south of France back in October 2022. Pretty much spent my entire career inside of startups, working as a software engineer. Eventually became like the cloud infrastructure person at numerous companies. And Jacob and I first met at a nonprofit called Thorn. I don't remember the dates exactly, but Jacob and I were brought in as effectively product software engineers, working on 3 different products. Thorn was a little bit of a special nonprofit, focused on a very like important problem inside of the dark web. And so we're essentially packaging up applications and services and deploying them into government facilities. So we got intimately familiar with like what it looks like to run Kubernetes clusters on Prem inside of air-gapped installations. We got intimately familiar with packaging up complex applications and services into Docker containers, and just kind of became this like de facto platform team at Thorn. Jacob and I eventually both left there together and joined a database startup called Era Software at the time that was really building effectively like a different take on the observability Elasticsearch space. And we were brought in to like build their platform as a service offering. And that meant like everything, nuts and bolts from the ground up. Lots of Kubernetes, lots of Docker containers, lots of CICD pipelines. And it was really at Era about, I want to say a year and a half in, that we were essentially packaging up 5 or 6 different Rust microservices that made up the database technology into like one big Helm chart. And each build of those containers inside of something like GitHub Actions was taking like 40 plus minutes. And so we just had this like, it's kind of like the perfect storm as a founder, or like as an engineer trying to become a founder. You're like, this problem sucks. I'm going to go solve this problem for myself. And so we just had this idea of what if we took BuildKit put it up on cloud VMs, and attach DBS volumes to it. And we were like operating off of this observation that Docker layer cache is like tens of gigabytes, and even larger nowadays when you start talking about like AI and LLMs and things like that. And just the act of saving and loading that layer cache inside of a managed GitHub Actions runner pretty much negated all performance gains of using the cache in general. Like that's how bad the networks were. And so we built a prototype that was essentially that. We launched BuildKit instances connected to them at that point of like a very rudimentary, I'll call it Depot CLI, is really like a bash script. And we didn't, like the hypothesis was by persisting the layer cache DBS volumes, we probably make builds twice as fast because it's just like instantly available, just like how it is on your local machine. And then that initial prototype didn't make the builds twice as fast. It made them 5 times faster. And that was like our first moment of, oh, wow, like this could be something. And really like from there, I would love to say like that was like the strike of imagination of like, oh, this could become a YC company. And like we'll hire people and like we'll focus on this. But like that idea, that was even then, like that wasn't a thing. And really, that was, I think that was January 2022, I want to say. And so we kind of just like set this goal for ourselves on the nights and weekends, like, all right, by May, let's have like a beta of this like end to end that we could like turn over to people. And so we built that. We launched that in like a beta mode. And we were also doing some like contracting stuff in the background, reached out to like some folks in our network. We're like, hey, like, do you want to try this thing out? Like, if this makes your builds faster, great. If it doesn't, like, sorry, I wasted your time, essentially. And we took the first like person that tried that. They had like 15-minute builds inside of Google Cloud Build. It's like some complex like PHP app inside of a Docker container. And we took their build to less than a minute.
Wow.
And that was like, at this point, to give everybody like context, at this point, like Depot v0 in that beta mode was purely a slightly optimized version of BuildKit and EBS volumes and a CLI. Like at that point, we hadn't even introduced like the concept of multi-platform image builds and native image builds and things like that. And so like to go from 15 minutes to less than a minute with what we considered like a prototype, that was when Depot, that was like when it grew its first leg, so to speak.
Yeah. And then so was this mostly a problem, like at this point, mostly a problem for CICD? Like maybe you wouldn't even notice it locally because you like your Docker cache, you know, you're storing at least some Docker cache locally. And then, but then when you push it to CICD, it's a mess. Or was it even a problem for local builds?
It was primarily CI/CD at that point because most people, when they build a Docker image locally, they're like, okay, like the first one sucks because I don't have any caching. And but then like inside of CI/CD, like you don't have your existing cache, right? Like you have to save and load it over networks. And that comes with a massive set of limitations that vary based on whatever CI provider you're tied to. But like, for example, with GitHub Actions, like you have 10 gigabytes of cache storage, which is like not enough when you're talking about a Docker layer cache. And then like you couple on top of that like it's under provisioned hardware, under provisioned networks, like it just slows everything down.
Yep. And like, was this a pretty, like, is almost everyone that's building with Docker and especially on CI/CD experiencing this problem, or does it require like either applications of significant size or complexity to like when you start to see this sort of thing?
I would say 99% of people are experiencing this problem. The 1% are the people that have gone to the great lengths of optimizing their Docker file to explicitly avoid this problem, or are running like their own version, their own idea of Depot internally, right? So like running a stateful EC2 instance with EBS volumes, or name your cloud provider. Like EC2 is just an example. And so like they're already married to that idea. So like, to give you an example of the 1%, I was talking to somebody that was like, yeah, I have like a 64 core EC2 instance that's just always running around the clock. And I like SSH into it and I git clone it and I run a build and then publish my binaries and push my registry from that machine. And it's like, cool. Like I may or may not agree with your process, but like that is a solution. Most people aren't doing that, or like they want to get out of the business of doing that, right? Like that comes with such a massive amount of overhead and security blast radius that a lot of people don't want to live in that world.
Tell me about the security blast radius. Like what should I be looking out for if I'm doing that myself, or what am I not even thinking about there?
Yeah, I mean, like it's just like anytime you're running a VM, right? You have to keep the AMI patch. You have to make sure like it doesn't have SSH access. It doesn't have egress out to malicious things. You have to run guard duty over the top of it. Make sure like nobody's going in there and like adding malicious app registries, things like that. There's so much. It sounds so simple on paper because you're just like, oh, I'm just going to run an EC2 instance. It's going to run my CI. Everything will be gravy. But I think what we're learning in the ecosystem at large is CI is probably, if you want to attack something, attack it at the CI level, because that will just propagate out everywhere.
Yep. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so tell me a little bit about architecture, what you all are doing. I assume you don't just have a 64 core instance sitting there ready to run build. So like, what's it look like on the Depot side, when a build gets kicked off?
Yeah. So on the Depot side, I would say we call this our provisioning system. I would say we're on V4 of our provisioning system nowadays. So this is the fourth iteration of it. Essentially what we do is we've created our own orchestration system. So when you run Depot build, inside of the Depot CLI, we're wrapping BuildX as a library. So we're doing all of the handshakes.
And hold on, what's BuildX?
So BuildX is the CLI that talks to a BuildKit instance. So you have a BuildKit instance running over on a server. BuildX is the communication channel at the CLI level that connects to it, streams a Docker image build over to BuildKit, and then BuildKit executes it from there. And so Depot build essentially does that handshake, tells our API like, hey, I need a BuildKit instance. Also tells our API which platforms you want to build for. So if you want to build just for Intel, we'll launch you an Intel machine. If you want to build just for ARM, we'll launch you an ARM machine. Or you can do a multi-platform build where you ask for an image that can run on both. And in that scenario, we launch both an Intel and ARM machine. The infrastructure behind that launching of one is where a large chunk of our optimization has come in. So launching an EC2 instance cold, as most people know, not very fast, 30 to 45 seconds in the best case, up to a minute in other scenarios. And so essentially what we do is we pool machines behind the scenes. So we have essentially created, I wish Amazon would build this feature with their warming pools functionality, but I digress. We essentially have a stopped pool of machines that we have pre-configured and pre-optimized to boot BuildKit as fast as possible. So build comes in, we can launch a BuildKit instance, connect to it, and start running your image build within 3 to 5 seconds.
That's bananas. Like, y'all had I think it was Jacob that had a great blog post on this recently on just like how you sped up that EC2 boot time and stuff for you. Like, you're saying 3 to 5 seconds, it's usually going. What was, initial, if I just say, create instance or whatever like that on normal EC2, what's that usually look like for folks?
Usually it looks between 30 and 45 seconds. But I think there's a lot of great blog posts out there about like the basic things around like how to optimize that EC2 instance. So like check the init config, remove all of the like installation of things that you don't actually need inside of the EMI. So like we covered all of those bases. And I think at that point we got it to, I want to say like 12 to 15 seconds, which is like doable, but one of the like cornerstones to Depot that we talk about quite frequently is we want to be the fastest to build anything.
Yep.
Like that is our objective. So like if there is seconds to save there, we're going to go find how to save those seconds. And so that led us to effectively, when you boot an EC2 instance, an AMI is streamed in from what is effectively like S3 and blob storage. And so what we can actually do is if you start an EC2 instance with an EBS volume, you can force EBS to read the entire EMI, and so that you essentially propagate the EMI to all of the blocks on the EBS volume, and then you stop it. And so like we stop it because we don't want to pay for compute that we're not using. And then when we restart it, it's just everything's freshly loaded right onto the EBS volume. And that's how we went from like the 12 to 15 seconds into the sub 5 seconds.
Yep. Okay. And then, so you're talking about storing this like Docker cache on an EBS instance. So if I create a project in Depot, are you basically like creating an EBS volume, and that's going to like, whenever I spin up a build, you're attaching that volume to my instance and then storing the results and removing it from an EC2 instance?
So that's effectively what V0 of Depot was. That's not the current version of Depot. So instead of using EBS, so we use EBS with like GitHub action runners, with the Depot managed GitHub action runners, and that's how we like propagate the GitHub action AMI down. But with Docker image builds, we've switched away from using EBS, and we actually use Ceph volumes. So our cache architecture is actually a Ceph storage cluster. And the reason for that is because we were able to like 12x the throughput, because Ceph uses instant storage. So it's effectively like full-blown real NVMe SSDs. So we run that cluster. But all the rest of what you just described is exactly the same. So we essentially treat Ceph volumes just like you would an EBS volume.
Yep. Okay. Wow, that's super cool. Okay. You talked a little bit about your background. Were you always like sort of an infrastructure engineer, like when you joined Thorn, or did you like, as you were like assigned to the platform team or started working on that, you just got deeper and deeper into this, but you used to be, full stack? Or like, I guess what's your story there?
Yeah, so my story is like I actually started in QA. I started as like a QA engineer while I was in college, and I was working for like a legal startup at the time back in Portland, and kind of just like made this jump into like full stack software engineer. Lots of front end, lots of back end, a lot of .NET. It's fun. It's funny to like look back on those times because like I haven't written .NET in probably like 10 years. But I was heavily focused on like full stack engineer. But my CTO and like mentor at the time was all in on AWS. Like he was AWS everything. Like the poster child for AWS to like make money. He wanted everything to be using an AWS service. And so I just like got entrenched in this like cloud ecosystem. I remember when serverless first came out, we switched a bunch of our architecture over to Lambda when that came out. And so that just like naturally made me interested in infrastructure. Like I became fascinated with the ability of like stitching together different AWS services. Eventually left that job and did like a short stint of consulting. And that's when I expanded my reach to outside of AWS. So went into like GCP primarily, a little bit of Azure as well. And then really it was at Thorn. Like I hadn't even really like touched containers. or Kubernetes for that matter, until I joined Thorn. And that was because, and Jacob had like a very similar path to mine, but rather than being like AWS cloud focused, it was very like containers, Kubernetes, and on-prem data centers. So he had like set up all of the initial infrastructure at Thorn, which was heavily Docker containers and Kubernetes. And I was just like, oh, like I've been wanting to learn this. So like this is perfect. Learned it on the job. Came to form like very strong opinions about Kubernetes from that job.
Tell me that, like, what are your opinions on Kubernetes?
I think Kubernetes is a lot of complexity for most engineering teams. And like, I would even venture to say, like, Jacob and I have talked a lot about this in like hindsight, looking back at our time at Thorn and Era, which is like, we probably weren't the right scale to like be using Kubernetes and things like that. Like those problems could have been solved in other ways. And it just introduces so much complexity and cognitive load to an engineering team that could be better used elsewhere. And I have like done a lot of like thinking of like why do we end up in those scenarios? I think it's I think everybody wants to build like a highly available, resilient system that's secure. And so we have this like knack of looking to those that are ahead of us. So like the engineering teams that we want to try to like model ourselves after. So like the Netflixes, the Amazons, the Googles. And we read about the technologies that they're using and they're like, oh, like to be that, we need to be using those technologies as well. And I think becoming a founder now, it's like my opinion is almost the exact opposite. Like you need to go use the services and technologies that like get you to the next step, because you don't know what you don't know the answer to the next question yet. So like just get to the next question and use the thing that gets you there the fastest. So if that's like running a stateful EC2 instance, that's just running one Docker container, like have at it. Don't go solve problems until you actually have them.
Yeah. So what does Depot's infrastructure look like behind the scenes?
So behind the scenes, we run our API is actually ran inside of Cloud Run. Our app runs inside of Cloud Run as well. So we just pack that up a Docker container, throw it in Cloud Run. We use PlanetScale behind the scenes for our database. And then we essentially we've talked about the provisioning system, EC2 instances, Ceph storage cluster. We use a little bit of Cloudflare for backing our ephemeral registry, primarily because if we were to run a registry over the top of S3, that would get very expensive very quickly because of egress traffic. So we essentially map and store blobs out of Amazon. So we use R2 for that.
And what kind of blob, like, are those Docker, like, is that part of the Docker layer cache, or is it, like, what kind of blobs are those that you're storing in R2?
Yeah, so that is effectively, we have a feature called an ephemeral registry where when you run a Depot build, we can save your built image off into a registry that we then delete after 24 hours. And the use case for this is actually like quite interesting. Is when we first launched Depot, people would be like, okay, like I'm going to build my Docker image, then I'm going to run some integration tests, and then over in this other workflow, I'm going to build my Docker image again and run some other integration tests and so on and so forth. But like the Docker image is the same for that commit, right? So they're just like essentially like building it once and then like starting up the build kit instance, running a 5-second build that's fully cached just to like pull the image back down. And so we introduced the idea of the ephemeral registry to essentially like just build it once and then save it in our registry. And then in the other workflows, you can just load it back. You just pull it back. And so what we do there is we essentially, we save it to ECR initially. And and then we replicate the layer blobs over to R2 and then delete the image out of ECR. So then when the registry, when you ask for that image by that build ID, we know to check like, oh, like it's not an ECR, cool, then it's already been replicated over to R2.
Interesting. Do you have a set, like, do you have a sense of like what your egress is from Cloudflare and how much that would cost in S3?
It's a few $100 now. It would be probably double inside of S3, just because of the egress pricing. That was from a registry predates Depot GitHub Action Runners. So before we ran GitHub Action Runners, people were just running their own GitHub Action Runners, and so like that was very painful for us when they did that workflow, because every time they're doing that, like it's pulling a 50 gigabyte image out of AWS and sending it to their GitHub Action Runner. But now most people use Depot's GitHub Action Runners with the Docker image build product. So in that scenario, we actually have like cut out R2 in that step because it's faster. Because the GitHub Action Runner is already in the same VPC as the ECR registry. So when you do the Depot pull, we just like reach over to ECR and pull it out. And so like that has no egress at that point, and is blazing fast.
Okay. So as I understand Depot, that like I sort of chunk it up into three different things. Let me know if I'm wrong on this. There's like remote Docker container builds, which could be me locally doing some stuff. It could be dev containers if I'm doing that sort of development. It could be my CI/CD system. So there's like Docker builds. There's also like the GitHub Action Runner, which is not necessarily a Docker build. And then there's like the build API. Is that am I understanding that rightly? The three sort of areas?
Yep. Okay. Those would be the three areas. The build API is effectively an API interface over the Docker image build product as it sits today.
And that's mostly for people that are running builds for other users. Is that correct? Like rather than like, my dev team, it might be like, hey, I'm actually offering some sort of service for folks.
Yep. Exactly. Okay. It's effectively the platform use case. So a Docker image build is one of the scariest builds that you can do because it requires a root on the system. Everything inside of a Docker world requires a root. This is like one of the large advantages to something like Podman. It's one of the reasons why that was a project that gained so much ground. And so effectively, we have a bunch of platform use cases where people need to build. They need to take their user's code, which is untrusted, right? Like they don't know what's in it. And they need to build a Docker image with that code inside of it. And then they want to turn around and run it inside of Kubernetes or whatever, wherever they're running their code. So they can't trust it, essentially. And so with Depot, they just essentially call us via an API. They're like, I want to build, like, here's the build context and the Docker file. We run it on our secure, isolated infrastructure, and then return them an image. So like they don't have to build any of that security hardening in-house. Like that's already set up with Depot.
Yeah. Can you give me a sense of, I guess, like maybe just like breakdown of like how much falls into, people are actually running Depot Bake or Depot Build, something like that. People using GitHub Actions, and then people that are submitting as part of like a build API. How does that sort of break down on your side?
Yeah, I would say when it comes to Depot Build and Bake, so like the Docker image build product, that's easily 80% of Depot nowadays. There's some like overlap in there where people use Depot GitHub Action Runners and the Docker image build product. But in total, I would say probably 35% use Depot GitHub Action Runners. And then there's like this 25% area of people using Depot as a build API.
Yeah. What are you seeing in the CI/CD market right now? Like, is GitHub Actions like just continue like taking up a giant share of that, or like what are you seeing there?
I think from the Depot side, like that's definitely what we see. GitHub Actions is kind of like eating the CI provider lunch in a lot of ways. There's other players out there, so BuildKite being one that's like gaining a lot of traction inside of the enterprise space because of its self-hosted capabilities. Then there's like, I would say I see a lot of people trying to get off of Circle CI. I'm not entirely clear as to like why, aside from like they feel it's too expensive. And a lot of them trying to switch off of Circle CI into GitHub Actions. So like those are the top three. And then you just have this like long tail of all of the other ones from there's still Travis and Jenkins and uh, even like more, some of them are like you don't realize they even existed. And so it's like I thought I knew the space of CI providers, and then it's like every 3 months, it's like, oh, I've never heard of this one.
Yep. Do you build integrations for like those long tail ones, or do mostly people just like hook in themselves?
We focus on like the integrations that people ask for. So like GitHub Actions, they definitely ask for a lot of integrations there. It was very important for us when we first started Depot to make, and it's still very important to us nowadays, is to make Depot like as stupidly easy to try. So I think like when we first launched Depot, we were like, make your builds 5 times faster and change a single line of code. And like we try to take that same philosophy and apply it to everything. So for example, like we have our own Depot build push action, which is like you literally just swap Docker build push action in your workflow for Depot build. So like you change one word and it just works. So we spend a lot of time on like the main ones. We're working on a Circle CI orb because that's been a request. I would say like where people usually ask for integrations is OIDC. So we support OIDC token exchanges with any of the CI providers that support that, which is like a really, I highly recommend that like if you're not using that today inside of a CI provider, like go use it. Access tokens inside of your CI secrets aren't that great. I think everybody wishes that like Circle CI would have introduced that idea before Circle CI had the incident. But it's something that like I'm starting to ask like more providers. So like any providers that we use, I'm starting to ask like, hey, like you should add this because I don't really want to put this static token inside of my CI.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. You also have Depot Managed, which, as I understand it, it's I talked to Sam Lambert from Planet Scale, and he had this idea of like cloud prem, right, where it's like in the cloud, but running some stuff, running it in your own account, so you have some management around that. Is that what how Depot Managed works?
Yep. So Depot Managed is effectively the data plane lives inside of your own AWS account. So you create a sub account inside of your AWS organization. We have a Terraform module that you run that provisions the Depot data plane inside of that account so that like we can deploy to it, but like you control the account, you control what access that account can touch into your other accounts. And it draws this like nice boundary for people that have that like security and compliance concern where they need to effectively have full control of their source code, even at a layer cache level, right? Like they don't want anything to leave their domain. And so that model like works really well for them. It is heavily inspired by PlanetScale, actually. Like we originally were doing like, okay, like Terraform module inside of your main AWS account. And that always felt brittle because it's like anytime we needed to like change something, like because starting today we're a 5-person team, but like up until like last Friday we were a 3-person team. So like we move fast on things. And so it was always felt like weird, like pinging like an infrastructure person at a company and being like, hey, can you like bump your module? And so this like sub account, grant permission to the sub account is like a nice model where we can still deploy into it. We can offer like support services over the top of it. But like the customer still has like total control of what access they grant that account.
Yep. Do you have pretty full access to that sub account then to go in and poke around?
I would have to go look at the permissions. We keep it pretty scoped down into what the data plane actually needs to touch. And we actually use there's the IAM policy trick where you can essentially like filter by tag. So you can say like, I only want to be able to touch resources that have this specific tag. And so we use that trick throughout the Terraform module to essentially say like, we have EC2 describe instances, we have EC2 launch instances, things like that, but it's like totally restricted to the VPCs, the EC2 instances, the EBS volumes, things like that, that like we have explicitly tagged with like that specific connection ID. So we really like scope it down into only the things that we need to touch.
Yep. Do you think this this sort of like cloud prem model, do you think that's going to last for 20 years, or are we like in this transitionary period where like some people are cautious, they want to touch everything on prem, or as they move to the cloud they want a little more control still? Or do you think like, hey, that's going to be something that fintech and banks and all those sorts of things are going to want forever?
Yeah, it's a really good question. My current opinion is like, I think it's going to be a thing that lasts forever. Because I think it's a good middle ground between the two extremes. So like the one extreme is like you use a SaaS, like you use Depot out of the box. Like we have the control plane, your data plane resides here. You lean on the fact that like we have SOC 2 compliance. You lean on like our security hardening. But then there's like the other extreme of like, we can't use the cloud. It must be in our data center. And I think like that's where, frankly, like I think that's where Kubernetes and things like that like really shine. Is like that technology is literally like lift and put anywhere. But it's like a nightmare developer experience, right? It's a nightmare developer experience. It's a nightmare support experience. And so this cloud prem model essentially like pushes back on both extremes and says like, okay, like let's meet in the middle. Let's have effectively like you can work with AWS or GCP or whoever to like VPC peer to your on-prem. And then we use this like central account to have your SaaS services that can then be highly restricted to talk to certain things inside of your on-prem data center.
Yeah. I think the way that AWS has made sort of account proliferation within an organization easier has really helped with some of that stuff, because like you have just like a much cleaner boundary than just having like one massive account and you have to lock down all this IAM and all kinds of stuff. Whereas like, man, that account boundary is really nice for helping restrict that stuff. So, all right. So I want to switch gears a little bit and just talk about like building and marketing a developer tool, because I think a lot of folks are interested in that. And I want to start off with some stats that I saw you publish. These are May stats, so a couple months old. I'm sure it's grown since then, but 720 builds, 1.8 million build minutes, which would have been 6 or 8 million if they weren't using Depot. And you're doing that with 3 people now 5 people. I guess like, what have you learned about developer marketing, or any like hard things you learn, advice you'd give people that are building a developer tool, and like how to reach people?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think June was our best month with Depot. So we did the 1,000,000 builds in a month in June, which was like a mind-blowing like experience, because for context, like when we first launched Depot, I think it took, let's say like 18 months to get our first 1,000,000 builds. And now we're doing 1,000,000 builds a month as of June.
I mean, and that's like 35% up from May too. So that's a pretty big growth rate there too.
Yeah. And that's like, we're now a team of 5. The 2 new folks, they just started literally yesterday. And so like we've gotten all the way to like doing 1,000,000 builds a month as a 3-person team. And so I think like lessons learned like along the way, well, I think I'm still constantly learning lessons. That's probably like the first lesson is there's no right answer and there's no wrong answer. So just like go try it. And I think I've like, I want to say like I've always had that like I've always had like, oh, I have this idea. I'm going to go try this idea as quickly as possible. But then I got into YC and realized that like I could 10x that. Like I could 10x that feeling and that sentiment. Because a lot of like our YC experience was, hey, Jacob and I have this marketing idea. And we would just like waffle on it. Like we're just like, I don't know. Like, is this the right thing? And our YC partners are really good. I would say like in general, what they were really good at was like smack you like upside your head and be like, that's like, there's 0% chance that like that decision is going to kill the company. So like you're wasting effort and energy, like overthinking it, like just go try the thing and see if it works. And so I think what like I try to take that into marketing now of like essentially speak my mind and say like what I really think, building a tool like this, and like be very transparent and open about like what it is like to be a founder and building a tool. I think one of the first things that like I learned was like figure out who you want to like model yourself after, like both at a company level and a founder level. And where I think a follow-up lesson to that is like people also go wrong with that idea. Is there you tell somebody like, okay, like you're going to build a developer tool company, who do you want to be like? And people will be like, oh, I want to be like AWS. And it's like, cool, but like AWS is doing how many billions of dollars in revenue? Like it's cool to like it's good to have that like thought exercise and be like how did AWS get to where it is when they were our size? But I found it more useful when it comes to like marketing and being a founder of essentially like who's a company in front of me, essentially. Like they're not an AWS yet, but they're 20 steps ahead of me. And like, how are they approaching it? Because it feels closer to where I am today, and is much easier to like practice concrete things.
Yep. Who is that for you?
I would say like for me, there's really like three companies. So Posthog is probably the biggest one. They have found like this perfect balance between talking about the product, but staying relentlessly focused on who their user is, and trying as much as possible to get out of their way. So I think like we're always trying to like borrow ideas from them, both from like a marketing standpoint, but also like building a company standpoint. Both the founders at PostHug are always very active, always open to sharing like what they know. Fly.io is another one. I think Kurt and the team over there, like they've changed the game of what it means to like build a technical marketing motion. They write such high quality content and like it shows. Like you can tell that it took 3 months to write this piece of content, and they also like don't hide their magic sauce, right? They're very open about what they're building and why they're building it. And I think we try to take that same approach with Depot. And sometimes like as a first time founder, like that's not always easy. But I think that's like one advantage that I have is like I have Jacob in my corner as well, and he acts like as a nice counterbalance to that. Like that's not going to be the thing that tanks the company. And then the third one is like somebody should like do a poll on this. I bet Supabase comes up if you ask this question like every single time. And the reason for that is actually quite interesting. Like Supabase has created a recipe that literally every developer tool founder would love to like replicate. And all of us are like trying to replicate the idea of a launch week, and all of us are not coming anywhere close to like what Supabase can do. But both the founders at Supabase are also like very open. It's very like Fly.io like, where like they share like how that idea came to be. And if folks have never like read that blog post, it's out on Supabase's blog. But essentially, like, the idea of a launch week was born out of Supabase coming out of YC. And they're like, oh, this like focusing on this thing for 3 months and then doing a big splashy thing is like actually a really productive way to work.
Yeah.
And that's effectively how launch weeks were born at Supabase. And so they're just like carrying their YC batch into the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Are those all three YC companies? I know Posthog and Supabase are. Is Fly also YC?
Yep. Fly is also a YC company. And so like I think like applying into YC for us, I don't think like this is a story that's really ever been told, but applying into YC for us was pretty much on a whim. We were like, I don't know, maybe we'll get in, maybe we won't. And like this was before all of the AI hype. This was before all of the Silicon Valley Bank stuff. And the tipping point for us was we had built Depot. We actually had a call with Kurt at Fly to be like, hey, like, look at this thing that we built. Because the context there is Fly has also learned a lot of the painful lessons around building containers for their platform. And they have like a whole bunch of tech that's tried to optimize that. And his advice was like, this is really cool. You should apply to YC. And so I was like, oh, like a YC founder said we should apply to YC. I think we should go apply to YC. And one of the like other bits of advice that I'll give specifically around applying to YC is I think Jacob and I spent 8 hours a day for a solid week going over our YC application. Like, wow. I think I answered every question on the YC application probably 20 to 25 times. And I think that's why we got in. Like we were very succinct, very clear in every question, like very clear where we want to go. So then when we had an interview, like it was still stressful as all get out. It was like the most stressful 10 minutes of my life. But I felt like super prepared. Like I was ready to answer everything. Like they couldn't throw a curveball at me that I wasn't ready to answer. And since that experience, I think as a YC founder, you always want to like pass it on. So like you always want to, oh, like this would be a great YC company. And so I've probably reviewed like 100 different YC applications for like past batches since ours. And I know within like the first 5 minutes of reading your YC application, if you've poured blood, sweat, and tears into it, or if you're just like, I don't know, maybe I want to do this.
Yep. Interesting. Does YC reach out to like previous founders and say, hey, will you help read applications? Or are those people reaching out to you saying, hey, would you look at my application before I submit it?
It's people reaching out to you and they're like, hey, would you look at my YC application before I submit it? Because it's effectively the first screen test, right? So,
yeah. And when you read it, do you tell people advice, and do they, like the people that haven't spent the time on it, do they put the time in, or are they just like, whatever?
I would say the people that don't put the time in, they usually bail out and like they don't take the advice. The people that put the time in, I try to provide like very constructive, like, hey, you shouldn't focus on this point. Like, you should focus on your you should focus on your market. You should focus on like what makes you unique as a founder. What's really fascinating, like reviewing YC applications, is how frequently founders think that YC wants to hear that you're going to hire people. And YC's advice is actually the polar opposite. And it's like well documented everywhere. Like if you follow Michael Siebel on Twitter, like hiring is the thing that will kill your startup. If you hire too soon, like you will kill your startup. And so many YC applications that I review are like, oh, like we want the 500K or whatever, because we want to hire 3 people and go to market and sales and marketing. And it's like, I think I've like reached a point in like reviewing some of those applications where I just like usually add a comment and it's like, you're the founder, like this will literally be your job for the foreseeable future. And like, you don't need to hire people. I think.
What's a good answer for what you would use the 500K for?
Really, it's you should speak to like how you'll use it to find product market fit, or how you'll use it to talk to your customers. So like there's a very famous story about the Airbnb founders. This is like, I'm paraphrasing the story because the story's documented elsewhere, but they essentially like used the money they got to fly from San Francisco to New York every week to go work with like their initial set of hosts, to like go take photos, to go set up the apartments that they were going to go list on Airbnb. And like that's what the money was for. Like they were living off of like literal ramen, right? And that's where like ramen profitability was born, because they needed to like buy their ramen the next week.
Yep. Yep. That's amazing. So do you think YC meaningfully changed the trajectory of Depot?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think if you're a developer tool, YC is definitely the thing to consider. And for us, like what it didn't like drastically change the product direction. Like I would say of our YC batch, we were one out of maybe 12 companies in our batch that didn't pivot. Like we went in working on Depot as it is today, and we came out working on Depot as it is today. A lot of folks pivot and they start working on other things, which comes with its own set of problems. But for us, it was effectively like a great way to get connected with an entire network and community. That's like when a bunch of YC founders get in the same room, it's like you may have never met each other, but like you know the problems that they're going through. It's like, oh, like you're at this stage, yeah, that stage sucks. Like here's what I did. But you'll also have like YC founders that were ahead of you, right? So like Post Hug and the Fly IOs, and they're like, oh yeah, I remember that stage. That stage was fun. This stage sucks. And so it's just like you have this like a group to lean on, to share experience with. And it's also like a great marketing channel. Like that's I don't think people publicly talk about that very often, but when you're a YC founder and a YC backed company, like that carries weight, because it's a lot like an Ivy League, like getting accepted into an Ivy League school. In fact, like it's harder to get into YC than an Ivy League school, based on the numbers from the last batch. Like it was something outrageous, like 25,000 plus applications in our batch, and they accepted like less than 300 or something. So it's like it's an acceptance rate that's really low.
Yep. What about fundraising? Like I know you raised 1.8 million seed, I believe. Like in your ideal world, are you like, hey, in 2 years we'll raise another round and grow, or are you like, hey, 1.8, I want that to be the last money we ever raise, or how do you think about fundraising?
Yeah, I think I take the YC approach to fundraising, which is raise to 1.8 and go find profitability, and then you control your own destiny, essentially. So if you can find profitability, like you get to decide what you do next. I think fundraising, which like not everybody thinks that way, right? So like I think Altman was recently quoted of like, I don't care if I burn like $1 billion a year or $5 billion a year. Like, I don't care. I'm building AGI. Like, we're going to change the world. So, like, that's a different problem domain, different way of thinking about it. For me, it's like my goal is to find profitability, and that allows me to control my destiny.
Yep. Yep. How close are you to profitability?
I would say we're looking somewhere between next year, and I think like that's like incredible for the size of team that we are. That's not easy to do, which that's where it like allows you to control your destiny, right? So I think doing things as a smart team or as a small team has like advantages. We get to control our burn, we get to keep costs low, we get to stay close to the customer, but like definitely comes with a set of disadvantages, where as a founder, I think when we were building Depot GitHub Action Runners, the three of us were probably working like 80 hours a week, like around the clock, effectively. which was cool. Like we built an entire in a third product in like 2.5 weeks, but I'd rather not like do that again. That was disruptive to my personal life. And so there's like, when you control your destiny, you essentially get to control your burn. So you can be like, okay, like we made however much more money this quarter, like that's enough money to like hire a person to do this in particular task or job. And I think that like that's the other thing that's why coming back to like the YC application and I'm going to go hire people, you have no idea who you need to hire yet. I didn't know who we needed to hire. Like we made our first hire right as we came out of YC. We hired another principal engineer, somebody that we've worked with for many years, because like we knew we needed somebody to go build even more technically complex architectures and solutions to different types of problems. And so like we can literally give him a problem and he will go figure it out. So like that one was very easy. But that was when we came out of YC, so it was like a year and a half ago now. I didn't know like who else we needed to hire until like 2.5 months ago, because effectively what you're doing initially as a dev tool founder is you're like, all right, I'm wearing like these 12 hats. Which one of these hats is like taking up 95% of my time that like is now at a stage where it's at a level of critical that I need to like give this to somebody else, because otherwise the business is going to suffer because I can't spend my time on the other 11 things I'm supposed to be doing. And so like you really have to like build a business for 18 months to 2 years to like really get an understanding of like, I need this person and this person. And I think that makes hiring a lot easier too, because you're like, oh, like I need this person to do this specific set of tasks or projects. Whereas like the 2020, 2021 boom of VC funding was like, we have so much money, I'm just gonna like hire these people that I think I need in the future. And then you're like in this world of you're burning money and trying to find work for these people that you didn't actually need to hire.
Yeah, yeah. And for you, so I saw that y'all hired a developer advocate recently. I believe that's one of the first, and that makes sense because I look at your like blog roll or your blog page, and it's just like you have a post every like 3 or 4 days, which is like pretty amazing pace. I imagine like took up a lot of time for you. What's the other role that you hired?
Yeah, so we hired another software engineer that's more focused on like the full stack application side of things. So he focuses on the application side. The principal software engineer that we hired over a year ago, he focuses largely on like the build architecture and the build pipeline side of things, and what are the things that we can optimize there or add into the future. Then Kyle, because he has a great name, that's why it's like this is a no-brainer. He's coming in as effectively our senior developer advocate, because like as I was just explaining, right? Like you were just talking about the blog index. Thanks for checking that out. Thank you for seeing my work.
There's a lot there. I'm impressed. Yeah.
You know, it's like to like have to go write content over and over and over again. But like as I was just explaining, like that was starting to take up like 95% of my time. And there's like a level of quality that I find so important in that it was like either I'm going to have to like start trimming back on the quality, or I'm not going to be able to go do the other 11 things. And so bringing somebody like Kyle in to like work on that doesn't even have to be like his full-time job, right? Like, because right now it's not my full-time job, right? Like I'm doing 11 other things. And so he'll be able to like focus on that, put quality into it, and then also go try other things out in the wild.
Yeah. Yeah. One last question on like profitability business stuff. Like you're making a developer tool, and specifically a developer tool where you have like infrastructure costs, right? It's not like a CLI or something. Like you have some serious infrastructure costs. Like how closely do you keep an eye on that? How much of your sort of monthly burn is infrastructure as compared to, salaries and other things like that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I watch infrastructure costs weekly, period. It's always something to be watching because you always need to know, like, when you're building something, like, people can do arbitrary builds inside of your environment. People can do arbitrary malicious things as well. And so like crypto miners is a great example. We have systems to like detect that and shut them down early, but there's always people doing weird things. So by watching your costs weekly, you can be like, oh, like, why on Thursday did this shoot up to 3x what we were spending usually? And so it like provides this like check-in point of like going back in time and being like, what was the usage like? What were people doing? And then steering and adjusting from there. In terms of like infrastructure costs compared to like other expenses, I'd say it's like the second or third largest expense, which isn't that surprising, honestly. Like, we're in the business of infrastructure. We're not running our own hardware. We think that comes with like its own set of disadvantages. And there's always optimizations that you can do. I think as we're growing as a company and as we're growing as a tool, what we're learning is like there's a lot of optimizations that we can do at an infrastructure level. There's also a ton of optimizations that we can do at a software level. And those are just like some of the things that we're really excited to start building, because it allows us to effectively like get into the software optimization side of things, which like we're kind of already doing with BuildKit today. Like, we're not running just vanilla BuildKit anymore. We've heavily optimized that to like our use case. But as you continue to like work in the space and you start to think about like build acceleration as a general problem, instead of just like what I will call like build compute or build clouds, that's just like heavily focused on like moving the build off of a developer's laptop. And I think like there's still this whole suite of optimizations where like code could still be running on a developer's laptop and it builds near instantly if we just like look at the software from a different angle.
Yeah. Wow, that's super interesting. Just a couple more like it's like work life stuff. Like you mentioned sort of those 80-hour weeks getting GitHub actions going. So first of all, you mentioned you moved to France. Are your other two, I guess now 5 of you, is anybody else in France or are they in the US or where are they?
No, I'm the only one that's in France. Jacob lives in London. Jacob's lived in London for 5 or 6 years now. Jacob's from Texas originally. I'm from Portland originally. Jacob kind of gave me the expat bug.
Yeah.
When I first started working with Jacob, he was living in Texas. I think 6 months later is when he moved to London. And then pretty much the entire time we've worked together, he's lived in London. When we first started Depot, I don't think like people realize this, but for the first year that we were building Depot, so through that beta phase, through that general like availability phase, there's a 9-hour time difference between the two of us. So Jacob was in London, I was in Portland. Jacob did a lot of working till like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning his time. So I'm in France, Jacob's in London. I have another folk in Minnesota, Philadelphia, and then back in San Francisco as well. So we've started like filling out the team, going west, for the obvious reason of like time zone. So yeah.
Yep. I know like you have a young kid and you mentioned like those just to work, like how all consuming this can be. Like how do you think about even like looking back a couple of years ago? Are you like, hey, I'm so glad I'm doing Depot, even though it's like crazy busy? Like, would you recommend a YC startup for folks? Like how would you recommend people think about that?
I think it's really like down to your own personal situation. So when I first met my wife back in college, I think like within the first 3 months, like she knew just based on like how I was working as a software engineer, always working in startups, and how I was always like building side projects. Like she knew that like someday I was gonna go like build a company. Like, and it's helpful that like she knew that by observing, because I definitely never like explicitly said that. But I've always known like this is what I wanted to go do. So like I've known this from the first software engineering job that I had, because I was like, I don't know, I was like the sixth or seventh employee at that company. And then it got acquired at 150 or 160 people. So like I got to see like all of the different like growing pains from 6 to 150, and then there's so many growing pains after that that I just like got addicted to that culture and like wearing those multiple hats. So for me, it was like, this is what I'm going to do. Uh, and I've always just been looking for like, where's my opportunity to go do that? I think for me, I thought I was gonna have to go like the solo founder route. Honestly, like I always found it hard to like go find that like-minded person. I was like just as hungry to go do something. But then I joined Thorn and I met Jacob, and Jacob and I spent a week in Dallas, like locked in a like police convention conference, like material that has like no interest to us, but we're just like there supporting the nonprofit. And we just like hung out for a week and talked about our lives and talked about like our tech backgrounds, talked about like where we want to go. And like I pretty much left that and I was like, yeah, like if I'm gonna start a company, like Jacob and I are going to find something.
Wow.
And pretty much from that point, like we were just like, I think we worked on like 6 or 7 different ideas that we thought we could like turn into companies before we landed on Depot. And then we landed on Depot and was like, oh, like this is the one. And that was kind of like how it went. I think when it comes to going down this path, it's definitely hard being a first-time dad and a first-time founder at the same time, because it sounds weird to say, but it feels like I have 2 kids that I have to like feed. I have Depot, like the startup, and then I have my son. But as my son's gotten older, it's like really fun and exciting to like talk to him about my work. It's fun and exciting to like have Discord calls with Jacob, and like he knows who Jacob is. Like he knows Jacob's like a co-founder to Depot. We have like swag stickers of like my corgi, and these are like all over his scooter that he takes to school every morning here in France. And so it's like it's hard. It definitely comes with challenges. I think having an excellent partner and my wife like helps with a lot of like the logistical challenges. But then like having Jacob as my partner inside of Depot, like he understands that like I have a toddler to take care of and I can't work till 5 o'clock in the morning. So he like shoulders the load when that's needed.
Yeah. Man, that's cool. Cool. I've loved this. Man, I hate to cut this off, but I gotta end with some quick fire questions and I'll let you get out of here. So quick fire questions. If you could master one skill you don't have right now, what would it be?
Delegation. I think like delegation is so important as a founder, and it's still like something that I'm learning every single day.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it just like you want to do it yourself and do it your specific way?
I think it's just like I struggle to like ask people for help, or like I struggle to like give people problems where I don't know the answer, because it's like that feels rude and mean. Like, hey, like this problem, it's here. I think we need to fix it. It sucks and I have no idea how to fix it. So like it feels harsh to like do that to people, but I think like what I'm learning is that's leadership. Essentially, is like you give people like you're hiring these people to go do these things. So just like turn them loose on it. Like you've brought them in with the skill set that they have. Like they're more than capable of going and solving those problems that you don't know the solution to.
Yeah. Yeah. What wastes the most time in your day?
Oh, that's a good question. All the spam emails that you get as a YC founder, probably. There's so many spam emails that you get. Everybody wants to pitch you everything that they're doing. I think the other thing is just like with hundreds of customers that we have nowadays, as a small team, like support can take up so much of your day. And it's usually like not even like product bug support. It's like educational support. And that's like, that can take up, it takes up so much of your day, but in a good way, because you stay so close to the user and like the problems that they're facing, and it sparks so many ideas. But that definitely like takes up a chunk of time.
I remember that from being at serverless, and like seriously, it takes up so much time, but it's like honestly the best way to just like stay so close to the ground and understand like what people are actually dealing with, what they're doing, and what they wish could happen. But yeah, you're right, it does take a lot of time. If you could invest in one company that's not the company you work for, has to be a private company, what would it be?
Oh, that's a good one. Oh, there's so many. Well, okay, so like the greedy side of me is like, if I could wind a clock back and go invest into OpenAI, like I'd go do that. Um, but like nobody knew that was like, I didn't see that coming. Um, I think Posthog is the one that jumps off the page to me because I just love their product. Like, uh, outside of like helping customer support and deleting spam emails, I spend 90% of my day inside of Posthog, just like monitoring Depot as a product and a business. So that would probably be like definitely near the top.
Yeah, I was wondering if it was going to be one of those three companies you mentioned. Which tool or technology could you not live without?
That's a good one. Well, Docker. Uh,
Yeah.
even uh, even if I have strong opinions about Docker, the technology, like Depot as a business wouldn't exist today. It's really fun to have Solomon as an angel investor inside of
Oh
Depot
yeah, that's
and
wild.
hear some of like the early stories of Docker, but then also just like observe the things that they're building at Dagger nowadays. So Docker would be the obvious one, but aside from the like joking answer, I think GitHub Copilot has become like fundamental to like my development process nowadays. Uh, it's hard to like look back even 3 years ago and be like, how did I like do this? Because it's just so good. It's so good at like just nailing the this is where I'm heading with this. And yeah, sure, like sometimes it's wrong, but like I don't ever intend to like turn an AI chatbot loose on an entire code base and just go deploy what it's doing. Like I'm still a software engineer at heart, but it makes me so much more productive. It's like what really opened my eyes to this idea of like, if we can make developers ridiculously productive inside of the IDE, if we can make builds ridiculously fast inside of CI and local, like we're approaching this world of like near instant like build and development cycles that will be able to build like businesses 5 years from now that used to take 15 years to build, and we'll build them in like 6 months.
Yeah, yeah. Do you? I mean, I love Copilot too. Do you kick out to like either ChatGPT or Claude or anything like that ever? Or are you mostly a Copilot type person?
I mostly stay inside of Copilot. If I'm like looking to write like some bespoke algorithm for like scheduling things, we'll usually start with like Copilot's chat feature. And then, but like that's me. I know like a lot of folks on the Depot team, like they'll go and ask like ChatGPT, particularly like you get into when you're building Depot, you get into these like you need to understand like the Linux kernel at like a super low level for some of the optimizations that we want to do. And you'll get this error back that's like super cryptic. And you're like, I have no idea what this means. And so like usually people like default to like Googling it. And now what I'm starting to see like in the Depot team is like people default to like asking ChatGPT or any of the other AI chatbots. And they're like 90% correct. And so like it gives you enough of a lead of like, oh, it's talking about this thing. And then you essentially know like the specific thing to go Google, right? Of like, oh, I need to optimize, I need to use this type of parameter inside of Ceph to get this performance, XYZ.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I find that too. Like if you don't know an area well enough, it's better to like rather than Google first, which might have a hit that's like in the direction, but might not. it's better to like, go to ChatGPT, and then it's going to like better point you in the direction of what you need.
Exactly.
On that same note, 5 years from now, will people be writing? Will there be more people writing code or less?
Oh, that's a good one. I'm gonna say more. I'm gonna go like contrary to the AI is going to replace software engineers. I think AI is going to produce more software engineers and more bad code that needs to go be fixed. I think I don't think it's going to kill jobs. I think it's going to create jobs, particularly like in both the tech spaces and creative spaces. Like I think there's this like video floating around of AI is going to like destroy artists, and I think uh, anybody that like I talk to, whether they're tech focused or not tech focused, it's actually making like a real human made art even more valuable, which I think is awesome. Like I think there's a use case for like AI generated art and things like that, but I think we also like need to pay great artists good money for their work, because the arts is really like that's the culture of the world. Like tech is not the culture of the world, and so I'm very like I think AI is going to create more jobs and not go and take everybody's job. We're not going to have a like Terminator situation.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Kyle, thanks for coming on. Like, it's great to catch up with you, and I learned a ton about just like company building and how to think about some of that stuff. So I appreciate you sharing all that stuff. If people want to find out more about you or Depot, where should they go?
Yeah, so you can check out Depot. It's Depot.dev. Sure, we'll drop a link. You can follow me on Twitter. It's just Kyle Galbraith. It's my handle on Twitter. Then you can follow me on Twitter or on LinkedIn. You can follow me on LinkedIn. I post a lot of like long form content. I'm starting to share more of my like expat story because I've spent so much time talking about Depot and building a dev tool that like there's a whole expat story to me that nobody's ever even heard.
Cool. I like that. So I'll be on the look out for that. But yeah, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. This was awesome. I love what Depot's doing, and best of luck to you all going forward.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.